I'll only be gone a few weeks, my mother said, zipping her suitcase without looking at me. There's food in the pantry. That was the last normal sentence I heard before everything stopped feeling normal. I was 11 years old, standing in our narrow kitchen in Dayton, Ohio, watching her drag a bright red suitcase across the tile floor. She smelled like expensive perfume I'd never seen her wear before. Europe, she told me. A month. Maybe less. She pressed a $20 bill into my hand like it was a secret between us. You're mature for your age, Emily. You'll be fine. I remember staring at that bill long after her car disappeared down the street. $20. That was supposed to stretch 30 days. I didn't cry. Not then. I told myself she trusted me. That this was some kind of test. I folded the money carefully and tucked it into the back pocket of my jeans like it was something fragile. The first few days felt almost adventurous. I poured cereal for dinner and watched late-night television with the volume low. I made a list of rules for myself on a yellow sticky note. Lock the doors, don't answer the phone, only use one light at a time. I counted cans in the pantry like inventory. 2 boxes of macaroni. 3 cans of green beans. Half a jar of peanut butter. I did the math in my head the way my teacher showed us on the chalkboard. Divide. Subtract. Stretch. By the end of the first week, the refrigerator hummed louder than usual, or maybe I just noticed it more. I stood in front of it one night and opened the door slowly. A half-gallon of milk. Mustard. A carton of eggs. I closed it and told myself it was enough. I started wearing the same hoodie to school every day because the house felt colder at night, and I didn't want to turn the heat up. The thermostat read 62 degrees. I told myself that wasn't so bad. Some kids camp outside for fun. I learned how to make ramen with just enough water so I wouldn't waste any. I learned how to shower quickly. 3 minutes. Maybe less. I stopped raising my hand in class because I was too tired to concentrate. When my teacher asked why my homework wasn't finished, I said my mom was out of town on business. That part wasn't entirely a lie. At night, I lay in bed listening to the house settle. Every creak sounded louder without another person breathing in the next room. I kept the hallway light on, even though I knew it cost money. I told myself she'd call soon. She'd wire more money like she promised. She'd ask if I was eating enough. But the phone stayed silent. The mailbox filled up. And somewhere between counting the last $2 in my pocket and staring at a pantry shelf that looked emptier than it should have, I realized something I didn't want to admit. This wasn't a test. And I wasn't supposed to be fine. By the second week, the house no longer felt adventurous. It felt hollow. I began measuring time by what was missing. The milk turned sour first. I poured it down the sink and watched it swirl away, telling myself it did not matter. I switched to dry cereal and tap water. The $20 had become 12, then 8, then 4. I kept the last $4 folded inside an envelope in my dresser drawer, as if saving it would somehow stretch the days shorter. At school, I avoided the cafeteria line because I did not want to admit my lunch account was empty. I told my friend Lily that I was not hungry. She shrugged and kept talking about a birthday party I knew I would not be invited to. I started counting how many hours I could sleep so I would not feel the ache in my stomach. 8 hours at night. Maybe an hour after school before it got dark. The thermostat stayed at 62 degrees. I wore 2 pairs of socks and wrapped myself in a blanket on the couch while doing homework under a single lamp. I unplugged everything else. The television stayed off. The quiet became something I carried around inside my chest. I checked my mother's social media on the old laptop she left behind. She had posted photos in front of stone buildings and wide fountains, smiling in a coat that looked new. The caption read, "Finding myself in Florence." I stared at the word finding. It felt strange. I wondered if she had lost something before she left, or if it was only me who had been misplaced. The mailbox began to overflow with envelopes stamped in red. Final notice. Past due. I stacked them neatly on the kitchen counter because it felt important to keep things orderly. Order meant control. Control meant she would come back. One afternoon, I came home to find the power flicker twice before settling. I stood very still, listening. When the lights steadied, I let out a breath I did not know I was holding. I began taking shorter showers, washing my hair every other day to save hot water. I stopped opening the refrigerator unless I had to. The eggs were gone. The peanut butter was gone. I scraped the last bit from the jar with a spoon and licked it slowly, pretending it was dessert. At night, I rehearsed what I would say if anyone asked questions. My mother is traveling. She will be home soon. I am responsible. I can take care of myself. I repeated it like a pledge. But one evening, as I sat at the kitchen table staring at a single slice of bread on a plate, I realized that responsibility was heavier than it sounded. It was heavier than $20. And it was heavier than I was. The third week began with a sound I had never noticed before, a soft mechanical click in the hallway followed by silence. I stood in the living room and waited. A second later, the lights blinked once and then went out completely. The refrigerator stopped humming. The house did not just feel hollow anymore, it felt still, as if it were holding its breath. I walked to the window and looked outside, expecting to see the whole street dark, but the porch light across the road was glowing steadily. That was when I understood. I did not panic. I moved slowly, the way you do when you are afraid sudden movement might make things worse. I found a flashlight in the kitchen drawer and tested it. The beam was weak but steady. I carried it from room to room, turning off switches that no longer mattered. I told myself it was temporary. Bills get mixed up. Mistakes happen. She would fix it. At school, I began staying later in the library, pretending I had a project. The warmth there wrapped around me like something safe. I finished homework carefully at one of the long wooden tables, stretching every minute before I had to walk home. When the final bell rang and the halls emptied, I took my time putting on my hoodie, delaying the quiet that waited for me. Mrs. Whitman from next door started asking questions. She leaned over the fence one afternoon while I was collecting the mail and said she had not seen my mother's car in a while. I smiled and said she was traveling for work. Mrs. Whitman looked at the stack of envelopes in my hand, then at me, then back at the house. Her smile did not reach her eyes. That night, I ate the last slice of bread plain. I sat at the kitchen table with the flashlight standing upright like a small tower of light. The shadows on the walls stretched long and thin. I thought about calling my mother, but every time I picked up the phone, I imagined her laughing in some bright cafe with no idea that the house was dark. I did not want to be the interruption. I did not want to be the problem. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm because the air felt colder than usual. I could see my breath when I exhaled. I dressed quickly and left without turning on any lights. At school, my teacher asked why I seemed tired. I told her I was studying harder. She nodded, satisfied with the answer. By the time Friday arrived, I had stopped checking the thermostat. There was no point. The house was not just empty of people now. It was empty of sound, of warmth, of the ordinary things that make a place feel lived in. When I walked up the driveway that afternoon, I noticed Mrs. Whitman standing on her porch, watching. She lifted her hand in a small wave. I lifted mine back. I did not know that she had already made a phone call. I only knew that the silence inside the house was about to be broken. The knock came just after 6 in the evening, 3 firm taps that echoed through the dark hallway. I froze in the kitchen, the flashlight still standing on the table beside an empty plate. For a moment I thought it might be my mother, that she had surprised me, that everything would rewind back to normal. The knock came again, steadier this time. I walked to the door slowly and pressed my eye to the small gap beside the curtain. A woman stood on the porch wearing a navy coat and holding a folder against her chest. A police officer stood a few feet behind her, not tense, just present. The porch light above them glowed warm against the early winter dusk. I opened the door halfway, keeping the chain latched. The woman smiled gently and asked if I was Emily Carter. I nodded. She introduced herself as Ms. Reynolds from Child Protective Services. Her voice was calm, almost soft, like she did not want to startle me. She asked if my mother was home. I felt the answer rise in my throat and settle there, heavy and complicated. I said she was traveling. Ms. Reynolds glanced past me into the dim hallway. She asked how long my mother had been gone. I counted silently before answering. Almost 3 weeks. She asked if there was another adult staying with me. I shook my head. The chain on the door suddenly felt very thin. She explained that a neighbor had called because they were concerned. Concerned. The word sounded polite, like something that belonged in a classroom discussion, not on my front porch. She asked if she could come inside and talk. I hesitated only a second before closing the door to unhook the chain. The house felt smaller once they stepped in. The officer remained near the doorway while Ms. Reynolds looked around quietly. She did not open drawers or lift cushions. She simply observed. The dark living room. The cold air. The stack of unopened mail on the counter. She asked what I had eaten that day. I told her cereal. She asked if there was heat. I said it was fine. My voice sounded practiced, like I had rehearsed it. She walked to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. The light did not turn on. She paused, then closed it gently. She did not react the way I expected. There was no anger in her face, only something steady and serious. She asked if my mother had left money. I told her about the $20, trying to say it like it was enough. She nodded slowly and wrote something down in her folder. When she asked if I felt safe, I answered yes before she finished the question. Because safe did not mean warm. It did not mean fed. It meant nothing bad had happened yet. She knelt slightly so we were closer to eye level and said they needed to make sure I was cared for properly. Properly. The word echoed in the quiet kitchen. I realized then that the silence in the house was no longer mine alone. It had witnesses. And for the first time since my mother drove away, I was not the only one counting what was missing. Ms. Reynolds did not rush her questions. She moved through the house slowly, as if she were reading a story written in the walls. She checked the thermostat and glanced at the dark vents. She ran her fingers lightly over the stack of unopened envelopes on the counter and asked when the electricity had gone out. I told her 2 days ago. She asked if I had called the utility company. I shook my head. I had memorized the number from one of the notices, but I did not think it was my place to call. Adults handled those things. She opened a kitchen cabinet and found only 2 cans of vegetables pushed to the back. She did not comment on it. She simply wrote more notes in her folder. The police officer stepped outside to speak quietly into his radio, leaving the front door cracked open so cold air drifted in. I stood by the table, feeling smaller than I had in weeks. Ms. Reynolds asked when I had last spoken to my mother. I said we had exchanged a few messages at the beginning of her trip. She asked if my mother had sent more money. I told her she had promised to wire some, but nothing had come. Ms. Reynolds nodded again, not surprised. She asked if I had any relatives nearby. I thought about my aunt in Michigan, someone I had met twice. I said I was not sure. She crouched down to my height and asked if I had been going to school every day. I said yes. She asked if I had been eating lunch. I hesitated. The silence answered for me. She did not scold me. She did not raise her voice. She said gently that it was not my job to make everything look normal. It was not my responsibility to manage bills or ration food. The word responsibility sounded different when she said it. It did not sound heavy. It sounded misplaced. She asked if she could take a few photos of the kitchen and the thermostat for documentation. I watched her lift a small camera from her bag and capture the empty refrigerator, the darkened hallway, the final notice stamped in red. The flash was brief and soft. Each click felt like proof being gathered. After a while, she explained that they needed to contact my mother immediately. She stepped outside to make the call. I stood in the doorway and listened to her voice drift through the cold air, firm but calm. She introduced herself and explained the situation. I could not hear my mother's response, but I saw Ms. Reynolds's expression change, not into anger, but into certainty. When she came back inside, she told me that arrangements would be made for me to stay somewhere safe and warm that night while they continued their investigation. She said it would be temporary, just until things were sorted out. I looked around the kitchen one more time. The flashlight still stood upright on the table. The envelope with the last $4 remained in my dresser upstairs. For weeks I had tried to protect the image of my mother, to hold it together with silence and careful answers. But as Ms. Reynolds closed her folder, I understood something quietly powerful. The house did not look neglected by accident. It looked abandoned. And for the first time, someone else had said so without using the word. They did not let me pack much. Ms. Reynolds said it was better to bring only essentials for now, just enough for a few days. I walked upstairs with her footsteps behind me, aware of how different the house felt with another adult present. I opened my dresser and took the envelope with the last $4, then hesitated before putting it back. It did not feel like mine anymore. It felt like evidence. I packed 2 pairs of jeans, 3 shirts, my toothbrush, and the small photo of my mother and me at the county fair 2 summers earlier. In that picture she was laughing, her arm wrapped tightly around my shoulders, both of us squinting in the sun. I slipped it between the pages of a notebook and zipped my backpack. When we stepped outside, the cold air felt sharper than before. Mrs. Whitman stood on her porch again, her hands clasped together. She gave me a look that was not pity and not relief, but something in between. Ms. Reynolds guided me toward her car, explaining that I would stay with a licensed foster family temporarily while they completed the assessment. The word assessment sounded clinical, like something done in a classroom. I watched my house through the car window as we pulled away. The porch light was still on. The windows were dark. It looked smaller than it had that morning. During the drive, Ms. Reynolds spoke gently about what would happen next. She said they had reached my mother by phone. She said my mother had insisted that everything was fine and that I was responsible enough to manage on my own. Ms. Reynolds did not argue with me about it. She simply stated that leaving a child alone for weeks without sufficient money, supervision, or utilities was not considered appropriate care. Appropriate care. The phrase lingered in my mind. She explained that they had requested copies of travel records and bank statements to understand the full situation. She mentioned social media posts that showed my mother in several cities across Italy and France during the same period that the bills at home had gone unpaid. I stared out the window at passing streetlights, trying to reconcile the image of her smiling in front of fountains with the dark kitchen she had left behind. Ms. Reynolds said the court would review the findings and determine next steps. There would be a hearing. There would be questions. I nodded as if I understood everything, though most of it felt distant and abstract. What I understood clearly was the shift. For weeks I had tried to protect her version of events, to frame the trip as temporary and harmless. Now there were documents, photographs, dates, and timestamps. There were professionals writing notes and making calls. There was a record forming that did not rely on my silence. When we arrived at a small brick house with a lit porch and warm yellow windows, Ms. Reynolds turned off the engine and looked at me carefully. She said this was not my fault. She said sometimes adults make choices that children are expected to carry, and that was not fair. I held my backpack tighter and stepped out of the car. As the front door opened and warm air spilled onto the porch, I realized that whatever the court would decide, whatever my mother would argue, something irreversible had already happened. The story was no longer just hers to tell. The house with the warm yellow windows belonged to a couple named Mark and Denise Holloway. They were in their late 40s, with calm voices and the kind of smiles that did not feel forced. Denise opened the door wide and stepped aside so I could enter first, as if I were a guest instead of a placement. The air inside smelled like something baking, cinnamon and butter. It felt almost too warm after weeks of careful rationing. I stood on the welcome mat for a moment, unsure where to put my shoes. Denise noticed and told me I could leave them by the door. Her tone was simple, not overly gentle, not rehearsed. Mark carried my backpack into a small bedroom at the end of the hallway and showed me where I could put my things. The bed was neatly made with a blue quilt. A lamp on the nightstand cast a steady glow. I had not realized how much I had missed steady light until that moment. Denise asked if I was hungry. I said I was fine, the automatic answer forming before I could stop it. She nodded but placed a bowl of warm soup in front of me anyway. I ate slowly at their kitchen table, careful not to seem too eager. The warmth spread through me in a way that felt almost shocking. No one asked me to justify why I was there. No one asked me to defend my mother. Later that evening, Ms. Reynolds called to check in. She spoke with Denise first, then asked to speak with me. She explained that my mother had responded to the formal notice. She had insisted that she had trusted me, that she had left food and money, that the trip was necessary for personal growth. Personal growth. The phrase sounded polished and distant. Ms. Reynolds said they had obtained copies of my mother's bank statements for the past month. There were multiple withdrawals in foreign cities, restaurant charges, hotel bookings. There were no transfers to the account that paid our utilities. There were no grocery purchases near our home. The timeline was clear. My mother had left the country within 24 hours of the electricity being disconnected. Ms. Reynolds told me gently that the court would review whether this situation met the legal definition of neglect. She did not use dramatic words. She did not need to. The facts were lined up like numbers in a math problem. After the call ended, I lay on the bed in the small blue room and stared at the ceiling. It was quiet there too, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was not hollow. It was restful. For the first time in weeks, I did not count cans or measure the length of a shower. I did not rehearse excuses. Instead, I replayed the image of my mother smiling in front of a fountain and tried to understand how two truths could exist at once. She could be searching for herself across Europe while I was sitting in the dark kitchen at home. But now there were records. There were statements. There were adults who had written everything down. And for the first time, the burden of explaining what had happened was no longer resting entirely on me. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning 2 weeks after I moved into the Holloway's house. Ms. Reynolds explained the process carefully, using words that sounded measured and deliberate. There would be a judge. There would be a review of documentation. There would be an opportunity for my mother to explain her decisions. I wore the only dress I had packed, a simple navy one that Denise pressed the night before. The courthouse in downtown Dayton felt larger than I imagined, with high ceilings and polished floors that echoed every footstep. I sat beside Ms. Reynolds on a wooden bench outside the courtroom while adults moved past us carrying folders and briefcases. When my mother walked down the hallway toward us, I almost did not recognize her at first. She looked rested. Her coat was tailored, her hair styled carefully. She smiled when she saw me, but it was the kind of smile meant for photographs, not for kitchens without electricity. She knelt briefly and said she missed me. I nodded but did not step forward. Inside the courtroom, everything felt structured and precise. The judge asked direct questions. Ms. Reynolds presented the timeline. Utility records showing service disconnection dates. Bank statements showing international transactions. Social media posts with timestamps. From Florence, Paris, and Nice. The numbers were read aloud calmly, like entries in a ledger. My mother explained that she believed I was capable and independent. She said she left cash and pantry supplies. She described the trip as necessary for her well-being. The judge asked whether arrangements had been made for adult supervision. My mother paused before answering that she had intended to check in remotely. The judge asked whether additional funds had been transferred after utilities were disconnected. There was another pause. I listened without looking at her. It was strange hearing the past few weeks reduced to dates and amounts. November 3rd, electricity terminated. November 4th, airline departure. November 7th, restaurant charge in Rome. Each detail was neutral on its own. Together, they formed something undeniable. The judge emphasized that independence does not replace legal responsibility. Children are not expected to manage household finances, ensure food supply, or maintain utilities. The decision that followed was not dramatic. It was firm. Temporary custody would remain with the state while my mother completed a formal parenting evaluation and demonstrated a stable plan for supervision and financial provision. Regular supervised visits would be arranged. Counseling was recommended. When the gavel tapped lightly against the bench, it did not sound loud. It sounded final. Outside the courtroom, my mother tried once more to speak to me privately, but Ms. Reynolds remained nearby. My mother said she never meant for things to look so bad. I understood then that what she regretted most was how it looked. As we walked back down the courthouse steps, the winter air felt sharp but clear. I realized that for weeks I had been holding together a story built on excuses and silence. Now the story had been examined under bright lights and recorded in official documents. It no longer depended on what I was willing to protect. It stood on facts, and those facts did not change when someone smiled. The weeks after the hearing settled into a rhythm that felt unfamiliar but steady. I returned to school from the Holloway's house each morning, riding in Denise's car with a packed lunch resting in my backpack. I no longer avoided the cafeteria line or counted the days by what was missing. Instead, I counted the pages in my homework planner and the minutes left before practice ended. Supervised visits with my mother were scheduled every Saturday afternoon at a small family services office near the courthouse. The room was simple, with 2 chairs, a table, and a box of board games stacked neatly in the corner. A case aide remained nearby, writing notes quietly while we talked. At first, our conversations circled around safe topics. School assignments. The weather. Whether I liked my new room. My mother spoke about the evaluation she was completing, about budgeting classes and parenting workshops. She said she understood now that independence at 11 is not the same as being prepared. I listened carefully, measuring her words the way I once measured cans in the pantry. Over time, the anger I expected to feel never arrived in dramatic waves. It came instead in small realizations. I realized that love without responsibility can feel warm in photographs but cold in practice. I realized that smiling in front of fountains does not cancel out a dark kitchen in Ohio. Most of all, I realized that the truth does not need to shout to be heard. It only needs to be documented. Months later, the court reviewed her progress. She had secured stable employment. She had arranged consistent childcare support through a community program. She had set up automatic payments for utilities and provided proof of savings. The judge acknowledged the effort but reminded her that rebuilding trust takes longer than rebuilding credit. A gradual reunification plan was approved, starting with extended supervised visits and moving slowly toward weekend stays. The decision was careful, not emotional. It was built on reports, attendance sheets, and financial statements. As I sat in the courtroom that day, I noticed how different everything felt from the first hearing. There were fewer surprises. More clarity. When we stepped outside afterward, my mother looked at me without the polished smile she had worn before. She looked uncertain, almost hopeful. I did not rush toward her, but I did not step away either. I understood now that the month she spent searching for herself had left a record that would follow both of us. It had reshaped the way adults around us saw responsibility. It had reshaped the way I understood protection. She left believing that I would manage on my own. What the system found was not just an empty refrigerator or unpaid bills. It found a child who had been trying to carry an adult story alone. And once that story was written down in official ink, it could not be erased by distance or by a return ticket home.